There is a particular silence that follows the moment. Someone finally stops chasing you. It is not loud. It does not announce itself with slammed doors or raised voices. It arrives quietly, a message left on read, a chair that stays empty, a name that no longer appears on a screen. And it is in that silence, that abrupt and unfamiliar quiet, that the people who once dismissed you, who once treated your presence as guaranteed, begin to feel something they never expected to feel: regret. Not because you punished them, not because you screamed or begged or demanded to be seen, but because you simply stopped. You became still. You became whole without them, and there is nothing on this earth more disorienting to a person who took you for granted than watching you walk away complete. Today we are going to walk through 9 attitudes, ancient, unshaken, deeply stoic in their architecture, that do not seek revenge, do not seek attention, and do not seek to make anyone suffer. And yet, paradoxically, these are the exact attitudes that make the very people who once overlooked you turn around, sometimes years later, and chase you with a desperation they cannot explain even to themselves. Stay until the end, because the 9th attitude is the one almost no one has the discipline to practice, and it is the one that changes everything. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the place where the oldest philosophy in the Western world meets the newest wounds of modern life. If you are new here, we take the teachings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, and we apply them, plainly and honestly, to the situations you are actually living through: heartbreak, betrayal, self-doubt, ambition, and the quiet war of becoming who you were meant to be. If that sounds like something you need today, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it means everything to a channel built entirely on ideas rather than noise. Now, let's begin. There is a temptation, when we feel unvalued, to imagine that the solution is escalation. Say more, explain more, prove more, beg subtly or openly to be seen the way we know we deserve to be seen. The Stoics would have found this approach not just ineffective, but philosophically backwards. Epictetus divided the world into 2 categories: things within our control and things outside of it. Our judgments, our choices, our effort, our character, these belong to us. Other people's perception of our worth, their timing, their regret, their eventual chasing, these do not belong to us. They never did. And here is the strange, almost mathematical truth hidden inside this teaching. The moment you stop trying to manufacture someone's respect, and instead pour that same energy into your own prohairesis, your own inner faculty of choice and character, you become, without even intending to, magnetic. Not because you performed indifference, because you actually became indifferent to their opinion of you and built something real in its place. This is not a video about manipulation tactics. We are not here to teach you tricks to make an exie jealous or a boss regretful through calculated silence. We are here to teach you something slower, sturdier, and infinitely more powerful: how to become the kind of person whose absence creates a vacuum nobody else can fill, as a side effect of finally valuing yourself the way Marcus Aurelius valued his own inner citadel. Let me introduce you to 3 people whose stories will walk beside us through this video. Eleanor, a woman who spent 4 years making herself smaller for people who never once made room for her. James, a man who confused loyalty with self-erasure until his very silence became the loudest thing about him. And Marco, who learned, almost too late, that the world does not chase what is given freely. It chases what it senses it might lose. Their stories are composites, but I promise you, you will recognize yourself in at least one of them before this video ends. Let's begin with attitude number 1. Attitude number 1. The stillness of unexplained silence. Eleanor had a habit for years of narrating her own worth. In group chats, in family dinners, in relationships, she would explain, defend, and clarify herself constantly, as though her value were a court case that needed constant relitigation. "I just don't want you to think I'm being difficult," she'd say. "I just want to explain why I felt hurt. I just need you to Understand where I'm coming from. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his private notebook, never intended for publication, that cuts directly against this instinct. He reminded himself again and again that he did not need to explain his reasoning to those who would not listen with good faith. If it is not right, do not do it, he wrote. If it is not true, do not say it. Notice what is absent from that instruction. There is no clause about convincing anyone else of your rightness. The Stoic obligation is to align with truth and virtue internally. It is not to win the argument externally. Elena's turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday. A friend, one she had bent over backward for repeatedly, cancelled on her for the fourth consecutive time, this time for something trivial. In the past, Elena would have sent a paragraph. She would have explained how it made her feel, cited the pattern, asked for change. This time she typed one sentence, "No worries," and then she put the phone down and did not pick it up again that night. No confrontation, no lecture, no performance of hurt feelings designed to extract an apology. Just stillness. Here is what almost nobody expects. Unexplained silence is disorienting to people who are used to being chased. When you stop narrating your hurt, stop justifying your boundaries, stop performing the emotional labor of managing someone else's guilt, you remove their ability to argue with you, because there is nothing being offered for them to argue against. Silence cannot be debated. It can only be sat with, and sitting with silence is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who has grown accustomed to your explanations functioning as reassurance that they haven't actually lost anything. This is not coldness, it is apatheia, the Stoic term often mistranslated as apathy, but which really describes freedom from being driven by disordered, reactive passion. You are not suppressing emotion, you are simply refusing to let your emotion become a performance staged for someone else's benefit. Within 3 weeks, that same friend who had cancelled on Elena 4 times began reaching out first. Small things at first. A text checking in, an invitation to coffee. Elena hadn't done anything except stop doing what she used to do. And that absence was, ironically, the loudest message she had ever sent. If you have ever caught yourself over-explaining a boundary, drop a comment below with the word stillness. I want to know how many of you recognize this pattern in yourselves, because I suspect it's more of you than you think. Attitude number 2, the refusal to compete for a seat at the table. James spent the better part of his 20s trying to earn permanent membership in circles that only ever offered him conditional access. A friend group that included him when convenient. A romantic partner who kept him in a strange orbit, never fully committed, never fully released. A workplace that praised his contributions in private and forgot to mention his name in public. James's mistake, and it is one of the most common mistakes a person can make, was believing that if he simply worked harder at being valuable, the conditional access would eventually convert into unconditional belonging. Seneca warned against exactly this miscalculation in his letters to Lucilius. He observed that some men spend their entire lives preparing to live, arranging every circumstance in hopes that someday, once enough conditions are met, they will finally be at peace, finally be respected, finally be enough. Seneca called this a kind of living death, postponing your own dignity indefinitely, always contingent on someone else's approval arriving on schedule. The turn for James came during a work project. He had quietly carried a team for months, staying late, fixing errors that weren't his, absorbing blame that wasn't his either, all in hopes that recognition someday would arrive. When the recognition finally came, it went to someone else, someone louder, someone who had done less work but asked for more credit. The old James would have worked twice as hard the following quarter, hoping the injustice would eventually correct itself if he simply proved his worth beyond doubt. The new James, the one shaped by months of quietly absorbing Stoic principles he hadn't yet had occasion to test, did something different. He stopped competing for the seat. He didn't quit dramatically. He didn't send an email outlining every slight. He simply began doing his job well, without the invisible campaign for approval running underneath every action. He stopped staying late for praise. He stopped over-functioning to be noticed. He began treating his own competence as sufficient unto itself, a Stoic idea. Marcus Aurelius returns to repeatedly, that virtue is its own reward, requiring no external witness to be complete. Something remarkable happens when a person stops competing for a seat. The table often turns around and offers it to them anyway, not because the strategy worked, but because desperation has a scent and its absence has an equally distinct one. People are drawn, almost against their will, toward those who no longer seem to need them. 6 months later, James was pulled aside by a director 2 levels above him, someone who had barely acknowledged his existence before, and offered a promotion James hadn't applied for. This is oikeiosis in its mature form, the Stoic concept describing our natural expanding circle of concern, which begins with self-preservation and radiates outward. But it only radiates healthily outward once it has first been properly rooted inward. James had spent years trying to root his sense of belonging in other people's tables. The moment he rooted it in himself, the tables began, unpromoted and unsolicited, to rearrange themselves around him. Ask yourself honestly, right now, is there a table you are still trying to earn a permanent seat at? One where you were only ever offered a temporary chair? Sit with that question. We'll come back to it. Attitude number 3, emotional self-sufficiency, the end of outsourced peace. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from making your emotional stability someone else's responsibility. You wait for their text to feel calm. You wait for their apology to feel resolved. You wait for their validation to feel worthy. And in waiting, you hand over the one thing Epictetus insisted, above all else, must remain entirely your own, your inner state. Marco lived this exhaustion for the better part of a relationship that lasted 3 years. His mood was a mirror of his partner's attention. A warm message and he floated through his day. A cold, delayed reply and his entire evening collapsed into anxious rumination. He was, in the Stoic sense, enslaved, not by chains, but by his own outsourced peace, handed over daily to someone who hadn't asked for the responsibility and, frankly, wasn't equipped to carry it. Epictetus opens his Enchiridion with the very distinction that would have saved Marco years of suffering. Some things are up to us, others are not. Our partner's mood, their consistency, their capacity to show up, these are not up to us. Our own composure, our own response, our own inner architecture, these are entirely up to us, always without exception, regardless of what anyone else does. The shift for Marco did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, through the accumulation of small refusals. The refusal to check his phone every 10 minutes. The refusal to let a delayed reply dictate his mood. The refusal to treat someone else's inconsistency as a referendum on his worth. He began building, brick by brick, as Marcus Aurelius describes constructing the inner citadel, a fortress within himself that outside weather could no longer flood. The strange thing about emotional self-sufficiency is that it is almost invisible from the outside, right up until the moment someone tries to disturb it and finds, to their genuine confusion, that they can't anymore. Marco's partner, who had grown comfortable with the certainty that her moods controlled his, began to notice a man who no longer collapsed when she withdrew. A man whose warmth toward her hadn't disappeared, but whose peace no longer depended on her supplying it. This unsettled her more than any argument ever could have. People who have grown used to controlling your emotional weather system experience something close to panic when they realize the climate inside you has changed on its own, without their permission and without their assistance. She began for the first time in the relationship initiating repair, not because Marco demanded it, because the absence of his old dependency revealed uncomfortably how much of the relationship's imbalance had been resting on it. Attitude number 4. The quiet, ruthless investment in your own growth. This is not a manipulation tactic. Marco did not build his inner citadel in order to provoke this reaction. He built it because Epictetus is right. Your peace should never be a hostage to someone else's schedule of attention. The chasing that sometimes follows is simply what happens when a person realizes the hostage has walked free, on their own terms, requiring no ransom paid by anyone. If any part of this attitude describes a relationship you're in right now, take 30 seconds and really consider. Whose hands is your peace currently sitting in? Type mine in the comments if you're ready to take it back. Attitude number 4. The quiet, ruthless investment in your own growth. There is a version of self-improvement that is, itself, a kind of begging, going to the gym to look good for someone, learning a new skill to impress someone, becoming better in order to finally deserve someone's attention. This is self-improvement wearing the mask of self-respect while still, underneath, orbiting entirely around another person's gaze. Then there is a different version, the version the Stoics actually taught, where growth is undertaken with total indifference to whether anyone is watching at all. Eleanor, whom we met earlier, entered this attitude almost by accident, after she stopped over-explaining herself to people who didn't deserve the explanation. She found herself with an unusual surplus. Hours in the evening, she used to spend drafting long messages, justifying her feelings, energy she used to spend anticipating other people's reactions. She didn't know what to do with the surplus at first. So she picked up an old interest she'd abandoned years earlier, painting. She didn't post it anywhere. She didn't tell anyone. She painted badly, then less badly, then genuinely well over the course of about a year, in near total privacy. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, again, in notes never meant for an audience, that the tranquility we seek is available to us the moment we retreat into our own mind, our own reasoning, our own discipline, regardless of external circumstance. Elena's painting became, without her fully realizing it, a practical exercise in exactly this retreat. What she could not have predicted was how this quiet, unwitnessed investment in herself would eventually ripple outward. A year later, at a gathering she almost didn't attend, someone noticed a photograph of one of her paintings on her phone's lock screen and asked about it. The friend group that had once treated her as an afterthought suddenly saw a dimension of her they hadn't known existed, not because she announced it, but because it had simply, quietly, become undeniably real. There is something the Stoics understood intuitively that modern psychology has only recently caught up to. People are not drawn to declarations of worth. They are drawn to the evidence of a life being well lived, evidence that requires no explanation because it speaks for itself. When you invest ruthlessly and quietly in your own growth, not to prove anything to anyone, but because Marcus Aurelius reminds us that our remaining time is genuinely, uncomfortably limited and wasting it waiting for others. Approval is its own tragedy. You generate a kind of gravity. People who once overlooked you begin, almost helplessly, to notice the orbit shifting. This is memento mori in practical form. Remembering that your time is finite is not meant to produce despair. It is meant to redirect your energy away from the exhausting project of being chosen by others and toward the sturdier project of becoming someone worth choosing first and primarily for yourself. Before we continue to Attitude 5, I want to ask you something honestly. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who takes their own growth seriously, and that already puts you ahead of most people who will never do the quiet work required to become the kind of person others regret losing. If this video is resonating with you, hit the like button now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these ideas, and it costs you nothing but a second of your time. And if you haven't yet subscribed, consider joining the small but growing community of people here who are choosing philosophy over impulsivity and character over chaos. Now, let's continue, because Attitude 5 is where things get uncomfortable for anyone who is ever confused. Peacekeeping with self-abandonment. Attitude number 5, the end of peacekeeping at your own expense. James's story returns here in a different chapter of his life. Long before the workplace incident, James had been, by his own admission, a chronic peacekeeper. In every disagreement, he was the one who apologized first, even when he hadn't been wrong. In every group decision, he was the one who deferred, even when his preference had been reasonable. He believed, quietly and without ever examining the belief closely, that keeping the peace was the same thing as being good. Epictetus would have gently corrected this belief. He taught that virtue requires the courage to speak truthfully and act rightly, even when doing so disturbs a false peace, a peace that was never real to begin with. Only a truce maintained by one person's constant self-erasure. A peace purchased at the price of your own dignity is not peace. It is a slow, ongoing surrender. The moment that cracked this pattern for James was small, almost embarrassingly so. A friend suggested in front of others that James's opinion on a shared project didn't really matter that much, since he wasn't really the creative type. The old James would have laughed it off, agreed even, to keep the room comfortable. The new James, the one who had begun slowly to internalize the Stoic distinction between what is and isn't within his control, said simply, "I disagree, and I'd like to be included in that decision." No raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, just a plain, undefended assertion of his own standing. The room went quiet. For a moment, the particular quiet that follows when someone stops performing smallness. And something shifted, not immediately, not dramatically, but unmistakably. People who had grown used to James absorbing every slight without resistance began, slowly, to treat him with a degree of consideration they hadn't extended before. Not because he demanded respect, but because he stopped rehearsing its absence. Marcus Aurelius wrote that it is not events that disturb people, but their judgments about events. James's old judgment that keeping others comfortable was more important than his own dignity had disturbed him for years, disguised as kindness. Once he corrected the judgment, the disturbance didn't just ease, it reversed, and those who had once taken his silence for granted began, almost imperceptibly, seeking his actual opinion, because they sensed, correctly, that it now came at a cost to ignore it. Attitude number 6, the discipline of not reacting to provocation. There is an old story about Marcus Aurelius that captures this attitude perfectly. Even if apocryphal in its exact details, it is said that when insulted publicly, he would pause, consider the insult with the same detached curiosity he might apply to studying an unfamiliar insect, and respond, if he responded at all, with such calm that the insult seemed to evaporate before it ever landed. Elena faced a version of this test when a family member, during a holiday gathering, made a pointed comment about her life choices in front of the entire table. The kind of comment engineered to provoke a reaction, to draw her into a defensive spiral that would confirm publicly that she was too sensitive or difficult. The old Elena would have taken the bait immediately, defending herself passionately, inadvertently proving the very narrative the comment was designed to establish. The Elena who had spent a year quietly painting, quietly building her inner citadel, did something different. She smiled, genuinely, not performatively, and said, "That's an interesting way to see it," before returning calmly to her meal. There was no counterattack, no defensive monologue, no visible disturbance at all. And here is the part almost nobody expects. Provocations that fail to provoke become, very quickly, embarrassing for the person who issued them. The family member, who had expected a reaction to feed off of, was left holding an insult that had nowhere to land. The table's attention, rather than turning against Elena, turned uncomfortably toward the relative who had tried and failed to unsettle her. Epictetus taught that no one can insult you without your cooperation, your agreement, internally, that the insult is deserved, or that it threatens something real. Elena's calm was not suppression. It was the genuine absence of that internal agreement. She simply did not believe, at the level that mattered, that this person's opinion had jurisdiction over her worth. This is one of the most powerful attitudes on this list, precisely because it is the hardest to fake. You cannot perform calm under provocation for very long. Eventually, the mask slips if the underlying belief hasn't actually changed. But when it has genuinely changed, when you have done the internal work Epictetus prescribes, provocation simply stops working on you, and people who once relied on your predictable reactions to feel a strange sense of control begin disoriented, to lose their grip on you entirely. Have you ever refused to take someone's bait and watched them scramble to recover? Tell me about it in the comments. These stories are some of my favorite to read. Attitude number 7. The protection of your own time and attention. Seneca opens one of his most famous letters, On the Shortness of Life, with an observation that still lands with force nearly 2,000 years later. It is not that we have too little time, but that we waste so much of it. And nowhere is this waste more common than in the countless hours people spend making themselves available to those who show no urgency in return. Marco, after rebuilding his emotional self-sufficiency, noticed a pattern he had never questioned before. He was always the first to respond, always the one who rearranged his schedule to accommodate others, always available on a moment's notice for people who took days to reply to him. He had, without realizing it, made his time a kind of open buffet, free, unlimited, and therefore, in the strange economics of human attention, undervalued. The shift began with something small. A friend who habitually cancelled plans last minute proposed a new outing. Instead of immediately clearing his schedule, as he always had, Marco checked his calendar honestly and replied 2 days later, "I can do the following weekend." Not cold, not punishing, simply realistic and no longer instantly available on command. The friend's response surprised him. Instead of the mild indifference Marco expected, there was a scramble to accommodate his timeline instead of the reverse. Something about Marco's time suddenly having visible limits made it, paradoxically, more valuable in the friend's eyes. Seneca would recognize this immediately. He observed that people guard their property, their money, their possessions fiercely, but hand over their time, the only truly non-renewable resource, to anyone who asks, as though it costs them nothing. When Marco began treating his time the way Seneca insisted it should be treated, as the most precious thing he owned, not to be distributed carelessly to those who had shown no comparable regard for it, the people around him recalibrated, almost instinctively, how much they valued access to him. This is not gamesmanship. It is simply honesty about what your time actually costs you, communicated not through explanation but through the plain fact of your calendar no longer bending instantly for everyone. Attitude number E, the acceptance that some people will never appreciate you, and the peace that follows. This attitude may be the most quietly radical one on this list, because it asks you to release something almost everyone secretly clings to, the hope that if you simply become good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, the person who has never valued you will finally see you clearly. Marcus Aurelius offers a piece of wisdom here that sounds almost harsh at first. He reminds himself repeatedly that other people will act according to their own nature, their own limitations, their own confusion, and that expecting otherwise is like being angry at a fig tree for producing figs. Some people are simply not capable, in a given season of their life, of recognizing what stands in front of them. Elena's mother had never once, in Elena's entire adult life, offered the kind of validation Elena had quietly hoped for. Every achievement was met with a subtle redirection toward what Elena hadn't yet done. Every attempt at closeness was met with a faint, almost imperceptible withdrawal. For years, Elena interpreted this as a problem to be solved. If she just explained herself better, achieved more, tried harder, surely her mother would finally see her. The turning point was not dramatic. It was Elena one evening, quietly accepting a truth she had spent years avoiding. Her mother might never fully see her, and that fact, however painful, said something about her mother's capacity, not about Elena's worth. This is amor fati in its most difficult application. Not the love of pleasant circumstances, but the acceptance of circumstances exactly as they are, without the exhausting demand that they be otherwise before you can be at peace. What followed was not resignation, but liberation. Elena stopped performing for her mother's approval. She still called, still visited, still loved her, but she stopped waiting. And in that release, something her years of trying had never achieved happened almost on its own. Her mother, sensing for the first time that Elena's warmth was no longer conditional on being reciprocated, and no longer anxious for validation that clearly wasn't coming, began, tentatively, imperfectly, to reach toward her in small ways she never had before. This does not always happen. Some people never come around, and the Stoic teaching does not promise that they will. What it promises is something more valuable. Your peace no longer depends on it either way. And ironically, it is precisely this release of expectation that most often creates the conditions under which people who withheld appreciation finally, belatedly begin to offer it. Attitude 9. The attitude almost. No one has the discipline to practice radical self-completion. Come now to the 9th attitude, the one I promised you at the very beginning of this video, the one that changes everything, and the one that almost no one has the discipline to fully practice, because it requires giving up the last hidden hope most people carry without even realizing it, the hope that someone else's eventual regret will complete something inside of us. Here is the uncomfortable truth beneath everything we have discussed today. If you practice attitudes 1 through 8 in order to make someone regret losing you, you have not actually practiced them. You have performed them waiting, arms folded, for an audience's reaction. And performances, unlike genuine transformation, tend to collapse the moment the anticipated audience fails to show up on schedule. The 9th attitude is this: becoming so genuinely, thoroughly complete within yourself that whether anyone ever comes back, whether anyone ever regrets anything at all, ceases to matter to your sense of peace. Marco reached this point roughly 2 years after his relationship ended, the relationship where he had once outsourced his entire emotional weather system to someone else's attention. He had done all the work, built his inner citadel, protected his time, refused provocation, accepted what he could not control. And then, one afternoon, his former partner reached out. The chasing that so many people quietly hope for eventually arrived, an earnest message expressing regret, wanting to reconnect. And Marco felt something surprisingly quiet. Not triumph, not vindication, not even much urgency to respond quickly. He noticed, with a kind of calm curiosity Epictetus would have recognized immediately, that the message which once would have consumed his entire week now simply existed as information, interesting, but no longer load-bearing for his sense of self. This is the final, hardest teaching of Stoicism as applied to being undervalued. The goal was never to be chased. The goal was to become a person for whom being chased or not chased carries the same fundamental weight, because your worth was never actually up for debate to begin with, and it was certainly never something another person's attention could confer or withdraw. Marco did eventually respond, kindly and honestly, and they had a conversation, one conducted from a place of genuine wholeness rather than hidden hope. What happened afterward matters far less than what had already happened. Before that message arrived, Marco had already, quietly, completely, come home to himself. This is the paradox the entire video has been circling. The people who most reliably make others regret losing them are precisely the people who have stopped needing that regret to feel whole. The chasing, when it comes to a door that is no longer waiting to be opened. And that, more than any strategy or clever silence, is what makes it undeniable. Let's return for a moment to where we began. That quiet corridor, that single candle flame, that particular silence that follows when someone finally stops chasing. Elena, James, and Marco each walked through that silence in their own way. Elena learning that her stillness needed no explanation. James learning that a seat at someone else's table was never worth earning through self-erasure. Marco learning that his peace was never anyone else's to hold, and that even regret, when it finally arrived, could not shake a foundation that no longer depended on it. None of them set out to make anyone chase them. That was never the point, and if it becomes your point, you will find these attitudes strangely resistant to being used as tools, because they only work, truly work, when they stop being strategies and become simply who you are. Marcus Aurelius wrote, near the end of his private meditations, something that feels like the truest closing thought we could offer here. That very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking, not in someone else's eventual regret, not in their belated chasing, in your own way of thinking, available to you the moment you choose to claim it. The people who didn't value you may come back. They may not. Both outcomes can coexist peacefully with a life that has already, quietly, become whole without their permission. If even one of these 9 attitudes struck something in you today, I'd genuinely love to know which one in the comments below, not for the algorithm, though it does help, but because this community has become one of the most thoughtful spaces on this platform, and your reflections often teach the rest of us as much as the videos do. If this video gave you something to sit with, consider subscribing to Wisdom of the Stoics. We release new explorations of ancient philosophy applied to modern struggles regularly, and there is a good chance the next one will speak directly to whatever you're carrying right now. And if you know someone who has been quietly shrinking themselves for people who never deserved that sacrifice, share this with them. Sometimes the kindest thing you can hand someone is not advice, but permission. Permission to finally stop chasing and start becoming complete. Until next time, walk your path with dignity. Guard your peace like Marcus Aurelius guarded his. And remember, you were never required to earn a place that was only ever yours to claim.